So Laura and I work in the employment unit at Community Legal Service of Philadelphia. Tonight, we're going to go through some recent changes to the paid sick leave laws here in Philadelphia, but also at the federal level related to COVID-19. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit them using the Q&A function or in the chat. We will do our best to get to all of the questions at the end of our presentation. First, I want to tell you a little bit about our organization, Community Legal Services. Community Legal Services is a legal service provider here in Philadelphia that provides free legal aid to community education and advocacy for low-wage workers in Philadelphia. Our office handles many different legal issues, not just employment issues, but some of the cases that Laura and I work on include workplace issues like wage theft, discrimination, and harassment. So as I mentioned in today's webinar, we're going to give you some updates to paid sick leave laws related to COVID-19. And we're also going to share a few real-life examples of cases that we've had here at CLS to help explain how these laws work in reality, and also to provide some advice about how you can request leave if you need it. Sorry there. So there's really a patchwork of laws that relate to paid sick time. Before the pandemic, there was really no right to paid sick leave under federal law or under Pennsylvania law. But since 2015, Philadelphia has had a law in place that provides paid sick leave to eligible employees whose employers are either based in Philadelphia or where the worker works in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, even today, a lot of workers don't know about their right to paid sick leave under the Philadelphia law. And in a lot of cases, employers as well aren't aware of their responsibility under the city's law. During the pandemic, this has changed. There are some new laws that have been passed at the federal level and also at the city level that provide additional paid sick leave to workers. So we're going to talk a little bit about these laws, how they interact, and in what kind of situations you might be able to get paid sick leave from your employer.
Before I go into this case study, I just want to remind you that we might make a little bit of pauses to allow the interpreter to deliver the message to people who are using the Spanish functionality. So we understand, first of all, after I explain this case study to you, we will be launching a poll. There's no right or wrong answer. So it's just a yes or no question. So don't be hesitant to answer the question just because you think you might not have the right answer. We know that this is also a lot of information. We are not expecting you to memorize everything. We are just trying to help you understand the law better. So we wanted to start with a case to help you understand how the laws apply to workers. So in this case, Carlos worked at a bakery since 2017 here in Philadelphia. And during the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic in July 2020, he missed work because he had a sinus infection. Carlos, being responsible, provided the doctor's note to his employer. And when he went to see the doctor also recommended that Carlos got a COVID test and, of course, stay at home for the quarantine recommended period, which I believe during the summer was probably 14 days. So Carlos told his supervisor that he needed more time off. In total, during this time that Carlos was dealing with the sinus infection, getting the COVID test and quarantining, he missed 16 days at work. In many instances, we know that this is a common practice. What happened to Carlos was that he was not paid for that leave, and because his employer didn't provide paid time off. So the question is Carlos eligible for paid sick leave? We're allowing participants to respond. Okay.
So far, we're getting about 100% yeses. I'm going to give people just 5 more seconds and then close the poll.
So we got 8 answers. They were all yes, and you are all correct. Carlos, during 2020, Carlos is likely eligible for 2 weeks of pay under federal and local law. The federal law is the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, and the local law is the Philadelphia Paid Sick Leave Ordinance. And he will be covered for the 16 days he was. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, we know this is a ton of information. We are just trying to help you identify when you are covered under these different laws. So something important that is to note here under federal law is that it only covers employers with fewer than 500 employees. And then what this law did when it was in effect was that it provided people with 2 weeks of paid sick leave if they were unable to go to work because of the issues like contracting COVID, experiencing COVID symptoms, caring for a family member who was diagnosed with COVID, or including caring for a child whose school closed because of the pandemic. But unfortunately, as we state on this slide, this law is no longer mandatory, which means that the employers now don't necessarily have to provide it. It's just leave for them as an option whether or not they want to comply with this law. And so yeah, this is, of course, we understand that it's not the best news, but there's a reason why we are explaining this to you.
Laura, are there any workers who are not covered by the federal paid leave law?
Unfortunately, yes. As with many laws, there are exceptions. So in this particular instance of the Federal Families First Coronavirus Act, there are certain government workers that are not covered. The worst part about this is that healthcare providers are also not covered under this law. Healthcare providers, for the purpose of this federal law, means emergency first responders, nurses, doctors, nursing home employees. So yeah, it's this law doesn't apply to them. But we are going to talk about other laws later.
And when the law says that workers can take time off if they need to care for a family member, who does that include?
For purposes of this law, family member means any immediate family relative, any person that lives in your household, regularly, not just staying with you for a couple of weeks or something, and someone who depends on your care during quarantine, for example, in this case, children, which is why the law also covered parents whose children were at home because the schools were closed.
And I have one more question. Can an employer force workers to use their own vacation time or their own kind of paid time off before using this federal paid sick leave?
No. Something very important to note about this law is that it's supposed to be provided in addition to other laws. It's just not supposed to be one or the other. And they can also not ask you to first exhaust other paid time off or sick time or vacation time that you might have available before you make use of this law.
So also, let me just ask you, I'm a bit confused about, this law being expired now. So are you saying that even if I was a worker and I was entitled to paid sick leave last year and didn't use it, but then I get COVID-19 this year and have to miss work, my employer doesn't have to give me paid sick leave now under this law?
I would like to give you a better answer, but yes, unfortunately, that's correct. Again, the federal law requirements are no longer mandatory. So the employer can choose to voluntarily provide the leave or not. If they choose to provide it, however, it's important to know that they can get reimbursed for the cost, meaning that they can, when they make their taxes, they can report it as a tax credit. Yeah, they can get it back in form of tax credit.
And what about someone who missed work in December of last year because they had COVID-19 but didn't know about the law and didn't get paid? Now if they come to CLS and they say, hey, I just found out about this and my employer never paid me, even though it's March now, can they still get paid sick leave for the time that they were out in December?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. That is correct. If people who didn't use this law or who might fall under this category and be covered under this law but didn't know about it, want to bring a claim against their employer, currently they can. And in fact, CLS has helped people in this situation who didn't know about their rights and never got paid for this leave, because we know that there are employers out there saying, if you miss work due to COVID or COVID-related reasons, we are not paying you. So yes, they can do that. We have taken these type of cases. We have recovered payment for people who are covered under this law. So definitely, if that was your situation last year and you didn't know about this, you can still probably bring a claim against the employer.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to launch another poll now just to kind of ask a question following up about our friend Carlos. So our question to our audience is, knowing this information, if Carlos missed 10 days of work in February of this year, in 2021, due to COVID-19, would he be entitled to federal paid sick leave? We have votes coming in. I'm going to give it a few more seconds here so everyone has time to think about it and answer. Your answers are anonymous. All right, we've got about 50%, so I'm going to share our results. So we've got some mixed results here between yes and no, but the majority of our attendees saying no. And the answer is no, unfortunately, because as Laura explained, the federal paid sick leave requirements ended on December 31st of last year. So at this point, if you need to miss work because of COVID-19 in 2021, unfortunately, the federal law, we're just talking about the federal law right now, is no longer mandatory. So your employer Carlos, in this case, his employer wouldn't be required to provide the paid sick leave under the federal law. But as Laura mentioned, the employer could choose to do so voluntarily, and they could get reimbursed for the costs of the leave through a federal tax credit program. I'm going to turn it back over to Laura to talk a bit more about another relevant law.
Yeah, now we're getting into the local laws. As the name says, this law regulates paid sick leave in Philadelphia. So the general rule is that workers who work at least 40 hours in the last year in Philadelphia are entitled to paid sick leave, to up to 40 hours of paid sick leave. Now, the tricky thing here is that, and we always ask this question when we have people coming to CLS, is that how many employees are there in your company? Because that will help us understand if the law applies to you or not. If there are more than 10 employees in the company, that entitles workers in Philadelphia to paid sick time. Generally, workers who work for the regular work week, which is 40 hours, accrue 1 hour per week. And so the cap is 40 hours a year, I believe. The rule is that you have to have, in order for you to use it, you have to work for your employer for 90 days. Now, that doesn't mean that you start accruing on the day 90. You start accruing since you start working for your employer, but you are able to use it after you have worked for them for 90 days. And of course, as we mentioned, with Carlos' example, during 2020, this is in addition to federal law if offered by your employer, because reminder, now it's mandatory. I mean, it's voluntary, not mandatory.
Laura, what about for employers that have fewer than 10 employees? Do those people get any paid sick leave?
Yes, but if the employer has 9 or less, the sick leave can be unpaid. So it doesn't require the employer to pay for your time out of work, but also it entitles employees to that time without pay.
And so are all workers in Philadelphia covered by this law?
No, unfortunately, as with the federal law, there are a few exceptions. This sick leave law does not cover federal employees or state employees, independent contractors, some seasonal workers or temporary workers, adjunct professors, interns, or workers who are unionized or covered under a collective bargaining agreement. Now, something that I want to point out also is that this law has been into effect since before the pandemic. So this law also entitles people to regular sick time, not only due to COVID reasons. During the pandemic has been extended to apply to the specific circumstances that we mentioned before, meaning that if you get COVID, if you have COVID symptoms and you're waiting for test results, if you're taking care of a family member who got diagnosed with COVID, this applies to you. But the law has existed in Philadelphia since 4 years ago.
And I know I get this question sometimes, Laura, but does it matter if a worker is paid in cash or under the table?
No, it doesn't matter. You are still entitled to accrue this time under the law. And also another thing that is important to note is that this law also applies for people who are undocumented. So it doesn't necessarily have to be only people with work authorization or US citizens. And
we should let everyone know that that's true for the federal law as well. It doesn't matter. Your immigration status, doesn't matter. And also if you're paid in cash, tips, whatever, you're still entitled to the leave.
So one other thing to note about this, and I think it's also the rule in laws in general, the employers are required to notify employees about these laws. They have to let them know about the rights. They have to display it on a common area where the employees are able to see the types of protection that they have.
So now we're going to change gears and do another case study. In this case, we have Mary. Mary is a home health aide at a large Philadelphia employer with more than 500 employees. Mary started working in January 2020, and she works 20 hours per week. On December 1st of 2020, so the end of last year, Mary tested positive for COVID-19. She advised her employer that she would be unable to work due to her diagnosis. She had complications from the coronavirus and was in treatment for some time, and she wasn't cleared to return to work until January 10th of 2021. So in this case, our question is Mary entitled to paid sick leave for the entire time she was out of work? And from the facts, we know that Mary was out for over a month due to complications from the coronavirus. So I'm going to launch another poll to see what everyone thinks about Mary's situation.
We encourage everyone to participate. A reminder that the answers are anonymous. There's no right or wrong answer. We just want to understand if you're able to realize the difference between one law and another, and help you with real life cases.
So we have some votes coming in. I'll give people a few more seconds to think about it. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. Let us know what you think. Okay, so just sharing our poll results. It looks like most people think that Mary is not entitled to paid sick leave for the entire month that she was out of work. The answer actually is yes, but I've kind of hidden some of the clues. Mary is not actually entitled to paid sick leave for the entire time under the laws we just discussed. As Laura mentioned, the federal law only applies to employers with less than 500 employees. So that would be an issue for Mary since she worked at a big employer. She's also a home health aide, so she could be exempt from the federal law based on being a healthcare provider. And also, as we're all aware, the federal law ended on December 31st. So even if the mandatory requirement of it ended on December 31st. So even if Mary could have gotten the federal leave, it wouldn't have been for the entire time. It would have been only until December 31st, not the 10 days that she was out in January. And again, while she might have some entitlement to paid sick leave under the Philadelphia law, really it's not a lot of time, so it wouldn't encompass the whole month that she was out of work. However, there are some new laws here in Philadelphia that might apply to Mary's situation. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about those. So the first law, went too far. The first law I'm going to talk about is the Philadelphia Public Health Emergency Leave. So this law is was basically passed in the fall of last year here in Philadelphia to expand upon the federal paid sick leave benefits. So it basically covers people who were excluded from the federal law. So people at big employers, healthcare workers, gig workers, notably, and domestic workers. So this was really helpful for people who couldn't get that 2 weeks of paid sick time under the federal law before. The problem is, however, that this public health emergency leave law here in Philadelphia was tied to the federal law, so it also expired on December 31st. So there's really a limited amount of time that people could get this leave from September 17th of last year till the end of the year. So here, even though Mary was probably not covered under the federal law, she would have been covered for the time up to December 31st under the Philadelphia law. And really this law is just kind of a mirror of the federal law. It's 2 weeks of paid sick time, up to 112 hours actually, for people who are out of work because they have COVID, they need to quarantine, they need to care for someone who's quarantining, the same set kind of circumstances. But there's actually another Philadelphia law that is more beneficial to Mary's situation. So, oh, there we go. Too far again, sorry. So also in the fall of last year, Philadelphia amended the paid sick leave law to provide more leave to healthcare employees who contract COVID-19. So this law actually provides, I will call it unlimited paid sick leave, but it is paid sick leave for the time that a healthcare worker is out because they have tested positive for COVID-19. So if you are like a home healthcare provider like Mary and you get COVID-19, you can be compensated for lost wages for the entire time that you're out related to COVID-19. So it includes time that you're getting treatment, the time that you're in quarantine, and time for recovery. And this law also requires employers to reimburse healthcare workers for medical expenses related to the virus. Under this law, the worker also must have worked at least 40 hours in the last 3 months prior to contracting COVID. So that's kind of the one requirement in addition to being a Philadelphia covered employer. But this law is more limited in the sense that it is only applying to healthcare workers, and it's more limited in its use. So workers can only use it if they actually test positive for COVID-19.
So, Rhiannon, I know a lot of healthcare workers are covered under a collective bargaining agreement, or what is also known as being unionized. Does this law apply to them?
Yeah, that's a good question, Laura. So one thing folks should know is that typically under Philadelphia's paid sick leave law, workplaces that are unionized, that have a collective bargaining agreement, aren't subject to those same kind of those 5-day paid sick day requirements. But there is an exception under the healthcare employee benefits law for that exception doesn't apply under this law. So for healthcare providers that are unionized or subject to a collective bargaining agreement, their employer still has to provide them with this paid leave.
Okay, so let's say a nurse, for example, needs to take time off for childcare because the nurse's children's school closed. Could they do so under this law?
No, so unfortunately, like I said, this law is a bit more narrow in how you can use it. So the worker in this situation that you've described wouldn't be able to use this specific paid leave for childcare. She could only use it if she herself had tested positive for COVID-19 and was unable to work for that reason. If the nurse in this situation needed paid time off because her kids' schools were closed due to COVID, then we would have to look at kind of the timing of the leave and whether she might be covered under the Philadelphia public health emergency leave law.
Okay, another question, only my last one. Do workers that are covered under this law have to prove they contracted the virus at work?
No, you don't have to prove that you got COVID-19 at the workplace. It just, the law doesn't have any specific language like that in it. So really, if you fall under the definition of a healthcare worker and you test positive for COVID during the pandemic, you are covered by this law. You don't have to give any sort of proof of where you got the virus from.
Right.
So I do just want to mention, I know people are really frustrated right now, and with kind of the expiration of the federal law and the fact that the federal law was insufficient to begin with, because I know a lot of folks that need more than 2 weeks off to either care for others, care for themselves, provide childcare. And, I'll be honest, with the expiration of the federal law and the Philly expansion, things are not great right now for workers. Especially, here in Philadelphia, where we've had a lot of cases over the winter. And, now we're seeing that that restaurants and other workplaces are starting to open up even more than they were before. But I do want to share that there are signs that there might be some action on the federal and the city level to expand paid sick leave. So right now at the federal level, there's talk of reinstating the paid leave provisions through September of this year, and also expanding the law to cover more employers. So right now it's limited to employers with less than 500. The bill that's out there right now would be also apply to larger employers. There's also talk of it covering healthcare workers and first responders who are currently exempted under the federal law, as well as increasing the amount that people can receive and the duration of the benefits. So more than 2 weeks or up to 12 weeks for childcare. Likewise, at the city level, there's currently a bill right now to expand public health emergency leave. This would essentially expand COVID-19 related paid sick leave to individuals at companies with more than 50 employees. So, and it would provide up to 80 hours of paid sick leave and be retroactive to January 1st. So kind of cover that period right now where people are in limbo and at kind of the whims of whether their employer wants to provide paid sick leave. This bill could change before it's passed, but right now it looks like there is movement to expand paid sick leave. Unfortunately, the bill that's out right now would leave a lot of folks at smaller employers with less than 50 employees without coverage, which is less than ideal. So I just want to give people some advice about how to request paid sick leave. Like I mentioned, these laws a lot of them are fairly new, so employers should know about them, but in some cases, they're not aware that they have to be providing this leave. In other cases, they don't want to provide the leave, and it puts workers kind of in a difficult position to have to ask for leave. But one thing we would suggest is if your employer has not given you any information about paid sick leave under Philadelphia law, under the federal law, you can request it from them. They are, as Laura mentioned, required to provide notice of your rights. And as we'll talk about a little later, I think there's always strength in numbers. So the extent that you can get together with your coworkers and make demands, it's always better to kind of put that collective pressure on the employer to provide leave that's required by law, or provide leave that maybe they're not required to give, but should be right now. If you need leave and you know that you're going to need leave, you should try and give notice to your employer as soon as possible. And it's always best to do it in writing in case there's some sort of dispute later. So if you can send an email, or at least even like write yourself a note of when you requested it and who you talked to and what they said. We find, when we're helping people after the fact try and get paid sick leave that their employer didn't give to them, it's always better to have records. And I do want to say that generally your employer cannot require you to provide a doctor's note for absences related to COVID-19. So under the law, you might have to tell your employer the name of the doctor that's saying you should quarantine, or the name of your child's school if you're saying your child's school is closed. But really, the law does not have a lot of documentation requirements under it, and we don't want to see employers asking workers who need to take time off, asking for lots and lots of documentation to support their requests.
So now, even in the event that neither of these laws apply to you for some reason or another, that doesn't mean that your employer is not required to. You cannot still request better policies. We always suggest to people or they organize to workers. And so, how will that look? The first step for us will be to speak to your coworkers so that you could discuss the issues that you are identifying at the workplace and decide exactly what you want to demand as a group. And I'm emphasizing as a group because when you do that, if you are trying to improve your working conditions at the workplace, there are laws that protect you as an employee when you do that. So of course, you are also welcome to contact CLS for advice about your rights and what can be done in your situation. Again, I emphasize the importance on doing it as a group because when you take action and try to demand better working conditions to your employer, and this applies whether if it's for COVID-related reasons or for other reasons, the National Labor Relations Act protects workers. That doesn't mean that if you do it by yourself, you're going to be unprotected, but it's just more difficult to defend in that type of situation. And of course, that means too, if in the event that you take action, go to your employer to demand better policies, and then you are retaliated against because of that, this law also will protect you from that. So just to help you understand better what type of actions can you take, as I mentioned, the first step will be speak to your coworkers and try to we always invite workers to do it in writing. Any type of petition, any type of demand or improvement that you're trying to seek from your employer, it's better if you do it in writing, because in that way there's documentation and there's dates and there's more evidence of what you're trying to do and the specific times when you ask and who you ask for improvements at the workplace. This can be in the form of a letter, an email, a petition signed by you and your coworkers that will be ultimately delivered to your boss. Another action that can be taken will be work with community groups, contact different organizations that help people understand their rights, ask customers to join you in the movement. Also hold demonstrations outside the workplace to encourage support. And let's not forget about the possibility that you have to escalate this and go to government agencies so that you can file a formal complaint for these reasons.
I'm going to launch another poll for the group. Our question for the audience is whether your employer can fire you for filing a complaint for unpaid sick time. Give folks a few more minutes to respond, or seconds to respond. And it looks like most people said no, your employer cannot fire you for filing a complaint for unpaid sick time. And that's correct. retaliation is prohibited under the law.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, and I think this applies to any of these laws that we have mentioned. If you want to enforce your rights under one of these laws that covers you, or if you want to request better conditions and get something more generous sick leave or get sick leave and understand your rights, your employer cannot take an adverse action against you or discriminate you or threaten to fire you because of this. If you find yourself in any of these situations, you can always contact CLS. There's also the resource to file the complaint with the Philadelphia Department of Labor. And then if you want to take this action, then your employer can also be fined with, you can get penalties for retaliating against you for exercising your rights. And if it's proven that your employer in fact retaliated against you, then you might also be able to recover or get other type of benefits, like recovering lost wages for the time that you were fired to the time that the resolution is found, or even if that's what you're seeking, even be reinstated at your job.
I just also note that retaliation based on your immigration status is also prohibited. So if you're an undocumented worker and your employer threatens any immigration action for asking for paid sick leave or taking paid sick leave, that is also prohibited under the law, and they could face additional penalties for that type of behavior.
We have a comment in the chat saying that I'm not sure how well these laws are enforced. Yeah, we are not necessarily sure either, but this is why we are trying to help people understand that these laws are available, so that then they can be informed and make an informed decision and proceed to take the appropriate corrective action. We understand that sometimes it's difficult to navigate the laws, understand them, and which is why we're trying to use this channel for people so that they can learn about them and then spread the word, and also be sure that if they decide to take action, they will also be covered, and there are protections for them.
I would just add to that, Laura, that the law here obviously isn't a solution for all of the problems that we're seeing right now. It's totally insufficient at times, but in a lot of cases, it can be a tool that we can use in different ways, whether it's putting pressure on employers for helping to organize workplaces, or even to try and push an employer to give paid sick leave when they haven't. Sometimes, at CLS, we don't always have to go to court or to file a complaint with an agency to resolve something. Sometimes we're able to just try and open a conversation with the employer and put pressure on them and tell them about what these laws require, and we're able to get a resolution. But I do want to just I don't want to, I think that it is very frustrating right now for workers because these laws are insufficient. It's not clear that they're being enforced very well, but that, we're going to all try and support each other through this.
Exactly. We have to be realistic, and we understand the frustration, and we sometimes are frustrated ourselves, but yeah, hopefully taking action and being informed and continue working for improvement of these laws and enforcement of these laws will help make it a better workplace for people who are covered under them. So yeah, some people were also asking probably how can you enforce your rights? As we mentioned, there's different avenues that you can take. For one, contact CLS. Another very important tool that you have here in the city is the Philadelphia Department of Labor. Now, it's also important that once you are aware or consider that that there's been a violation of your rights, that you take action as soon as you can, because there's a statute of limitations or otherwise a deadline for when you can complain about your incident. In this case of like the paid sick leave laws in Philadelphia is 1 year of the incident. So that means, for example, if you are fired today for one of the reasons that we had mentioned, then you will have until March 4 next year as the deadline to submit a complaint. The complaint process is very easy. We are sharing the information for you. You can do it by phone. If your first language is not English, they also have language access assistance so that they can help you fill out the form. You can easily find the form online. It will I can tell you that it will not take more than 10 minutes of your time to fill it out. It's very simple. And yeah, we're gonna walk you through the process of how to find this information online so that if you want to file a complaint.
I'm just gonna go quickly through this so we have time for some Q&A. If you just simply search Google for Philadelphia COVID-19 paid sick leave, the first thing that comes up should be a philadelphia.gov website. If you click on that, the next thing you'll see is a COVID-19 page that has pandemic paid sick leave resources. If you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you'll see a kind of resource box, including the complaint form is at the top of the box. If you click on the little icon on the right, you'll be able to download it and print it out or fill it out electronically. So this is what the form looks like. It's just one page. And you can email it to the COVID-19 workplace protections at phila.gov, or you can mail the completed form to the Department of Labor. And someone from the department will contact you to follow up about your claim in around 2 weeks. So it's a pretty simple process to file a complaint. And if you speak a language other than English and are having trouble with the form, you can always call, as Laura mentioned, and there is language assistance available. So now we're gonna try and address, we've been getting a lot of questions throughout the presentation. So I just wanted, if you have some lingering questions that you wanna add to the chat right now, we will try and go through some of them. I also invite people, if you have stories about needing paid sick leave and not being able to get it, or success stories where you were able to get paid sick leave from your employer, to also share those if you feel comfortable doing so. I know one question we had was about what if you basically have used up all your paid sick leave? If you are out, if you're on FMLA leave, or if you're unable to work because of COVID-19, if it's because you have some sort of health condition that you can't go into work, or you have childcare obligations that make it hard for you to work, and your employer is not going to let you work remotely, you might be eligible for unemployment benefits in that situation. Or pandemic unemployment assistance. And our sister organization, Philadelphia Legal Assistance, has a lot of information about that on their website. So we have a question about city sanitation workers and parking authority workers not adhering to COVID rules and what they can do to protect themselves. There are ways for workers who feel that their employers don't have proper health and safety precautions in place to make complaints. I mean, of course, the first thing that we always recommend is for workers to get together and make a collective demand for improvements. So if you need PPE or other things in the workplace, as Laura mentioned, kind of writing a group letter, creating a petition, you could set up an anonymous email account and send it to the employer. That way, if people are concerned about retaliation. But when workers act together as a group, or if one worker raises concerns on behalf of other workers, you have additional legal protections against retaliation. So, we always try and think about ways to put pressure on employers as a group first. If the employer is not going to correct the situation, there are ways to report. The city has an anti-retaliation law that's specific to health and safety concerns. So if you raise these concerns to your employer and they do not address them, you can actually refuse to return to work in that situation. And also, if your employer retaliates against you, there are additional protections under Philadelphia law. We have some other kind of training materials about health and safety issues on our website, and videos as well on our YouTube channel, Worker Wednesday channel. But there are also additional protections under federal law OSHA, but there isn't great enforcement there. But we're hoping under the new administration, the OSHA protections will be stronger and people can file complaints. There is a way to, if you call 311, you can report employers in Philadelphia that aren't following the health and safety requirements. I see another question in our chat, a worker who tested positive recently and has been out of work. Looks like they had been given the FMLA form to fill out by their employer. So one thing that happens is if there isn't any paid sick leave available, another option is FMLA leave. So this is the Federal Family Medical Leave Act. And that's 12 weeks of job protected leave, but it's unpaid, unfortunately. So for people that don't have either used up all their paid sick leave or don't have any more available, FMLA is an option. It's job protected. So if you go out on FMLA leave, your employer is required to kind of hold your job open for you. But as I mentioned, FMLA is unpaid. In some circumstances, you might be able to collect if you could work remotely. So if you're taking FMLA leave because you have a health condition that puts you at high risk, and your job requires you to be in person, so you basically have to have been told by your doctor to quarantine because of your health condition, and your employer says you cannot do your job remotely. In that situation, you might be entitled to FMLA leave and also unemployment benefits. So as long as for unemployment, you have to be able and available to work. So if you would be able to do some work remotely, in those cases, even though FMLA is unpaid, you might be able to still collect unemployment benefits during that time, even though you're technically not unemployed. If you're in a situation like that, it is a bit complicated. So we do recommend people that have questions reach out to CLS for advice. There was a question also about the amount of hours that you need to be eligible for FMLA. There are some requirements to who can get FMLA leave. Let me check and I will answer that in just a second. So just to confirm, for FMLA leave, you have to work for a covered employer, so there is a size requirement. You have to work at least 1,250 hours during the 12 months prior to the start of the leave. So long as you've have been working pretty consistently in the last year, you should be eligible. And you must have worked for your employer. I think the big thing is you must have worked for your employer for at least a year before you can get FMLA leave. And that's something we run into a lot, where people just haven't worked there long enough to be able to collect FMLA. Any other questions that folks would like us to address? You can go ahead and add them in the chat. I would also just point out, these laws are really confusing, even for us who we deal with them on a regular basis. There's a lot of different laws and they overlap, and it's very confusing because everyone's situation is different. So we have some resources on our website, clsphila.org, but also if you work in Philadelphia, the city phila.gov website, if you look at their information for workers, has a lot of good charts and information pages about the different paid sick leave that can help you figure out what you might be entitled to. Okay, well, I don't think we have any more questions here in the chat. I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And we hope that this was helpful and informative. And of course, people are always welcome to contact CLS if they need help. If you have a paid sick leave case, questions, or wage theft issues, you can always contact our workers' rights hotline. The number is there on the screen. And like I said, visit our website. We have plenty of information, not only about wage and hour and employment issues, but housing and benefits, things like that. So thank you everyone for joining us. And again, we'll be sharing this video on Facebook afterwards if you found it informative and want to share it with others. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.